Thank you, John, for all of that and for loving Hold Still, which I told him it's a big thing. Um, Leslie and I talked a little before this, so we're going to talk a little about intimacy, and I'm going to read two short scenes around different relationships that the main character has with different women in her life, one in the present action and one in the past. The first is with a woman she's just met who she refers to only throughout the book as the Chilean writer. We agreed to split a cheeseburger. She says she can never finish one all by herself, and though I'm starving, haven't eaten all day, I'm too thrilled by the suggested intimacy to refuse. She serves me in a clutch from her plate to mine half of the French fries, and we eat almost all of the food, not saying much in not very long a time. We talk at first about books and about teaching. I tell her I wanted to be an academic because books always made more sense to me than people, because words written down couldn't be refuted later on. I'm always shocked, I tell her, when I see students outside of class and have to talk to them about anything but whatever we've read together, when I have to make up the ideas and the questions from scratch. She says she became a writer because it was the only space in which she ever had control. I wrote about real people, she tells me, except I could do things to them, with them. I wasn't ineffectual in the face of whatever wants or needs they had. I forgot, she says, that the actual people would still be there, and the same when I was done. I like looking at her as she talks. We sit at a small table in chairs with caned backs and thin red cushions. I want to take my shoes off, to pull my knees up to my chest. The tables are close to one another, and when people get up on either side of us, they have to hold their coats and bags up over their heads so they don't brush against us as they walk past. The lighting's dim and the walls are red to match the cushions. There are booths along both back walls and worn movie posters hung behind the bar, the titles of which are all in French. I used to listen to my drunk sister, she says, on the phone for hours. She talked about her awful life, she says, her bipolar, perennially out of work husband, her insane, drug-addled, Asperger's, ADHD kids. She chews a fry and smiles at me. I took notes, she says. I eat the last bite of my cheeseburger. It's too big a bite, and I hold my hand over my mouth as she waits for me to speak and then goes on. I always asked her, she says, if I could use it. Carla, I said, I'm going to use this in my work. Is that okay? The Chilean writer looks past me through the window to the street where students walk past in clusters, where cabs and large dark SUVs drive by. She said yes every time, but she was drunk. The waiter brings a second round of beers, and I hold my thumb over the lip, not eager to drink it. I don't like beer, really. But when she mentioned that the beer list looked good, I wanted to be like her, so I ordered what she got. She killed herself, says the Chilean writer. She sips her beer then, and I sip mine right after. I haven't written about it yet, she says. And the next is very short and is from the past tense of the book. It was hot already, wet and sticky. College. I was 19, she was 20. She'd driven from her school 3 hours away to spend the summer with me, and she shaved my head out on the roof of the row house I shared with two other girls and laughed as large chunks of hair fell down to the porch. The buzz of her hands on my neck was the closest that I'd come to joy in years. For weeks we'd talked about it, a joke I made that she latched onto. I liked the thrill she seemed to get at the prospect, a sort of recklessness I'd receded from. Mostly then I was locked up in my attic room, just as hers was amping up. I didn't think I'd care what I looked like after. I had images of waif-like women with large features staring back at me from pictures that I'd found online when we first discussed shaving my head. I must have cared if I searched this. I must have been invested in how it'd turn out in the end. These women were all barefaced, as well as bareheaded. Sinead O'Connor, cancer victims, Yael Stone. All of them wide-eyed toward the camera, all of them gaunt. Their features threatened from their faces, big and unprotected, unapologetic. It was the viewer, though, who seemed to need protecting then. That my features were too small and my face already too wide and blunt was not something I'd considered. That I'd gained weight and what would always be too soft had gotten softer was something I tried not to think about. But then the hair had fallen to the porch and we were sweeping it into the trash, and there was nothing to be done but to wear skull caps in the wet summer heat and try to forget it was possible that I was making passersby afraid. I didn't mind because she loved me like that. She loved me most when, at night, she'd rub my back as I cried about whatever small thing made me cry that day, and she could tell me my crying was allowed and important, that she'd be there no matter what. She reached her hands over the nubs of my head, strong and sure and doting. She talked and talked until I fell asleep. And that's it.
So wonderful to hear you read. You know that it says a lot for the power of a reading when even over Zoom it feels so intimate and alive. And I know, I mean, when we were talking earlier about what would be exciting to hear, and I guess I should just start by saying, many of you maybe have already read this book. If you haven't, I envy you that you get to read it for the first time, because it's so truly stirring in like every sense of the word. It's unnerving, it's moving, it's true in this like deep, like feel it in your marrow way. It's thrilling to talk about it, not only because it's such a beautiful book, but because I love talking to Lynn about anything under any conditions. So getting to talk to her about her wonderful work is sort of the best possible conditions. When we were thinking about what might be nice to hear aloud, part of what felt so right about these two scenes is kind of how they chimed in both being these moments of intimacy between women and intimacy that involved the body and touch, but sort of unexpected forms of touch, the intimacy of a woman giving a clutch of fries, or the intimacy of one friend shaving another's head and then holding that head as she cries. And I guess maybe part of what feels wonderful about hearing a scene from the present tense of the novel and the past tense of the novel is that it, to me, opens up the question of like, what are these two storylines doing? There's sort of one storyline about the friendship between these two women, Elizabeth and Sasha, when they're at first young teenagers and then through their sort of coming of age. And then there's another plot line that focuses much more fully on Elizabeth and her family crafting a sort of precarious adult existence in Brooklyn. And maybe as a place to begin, you could talk about why it felt important for the novel to include both of those tenses and what those stories are doing alongside each other.
I think, thank you first, and yeah, thank you. But I think one thing that I was interested in, I mean, first of all, I was interested very much in this being a novel, which is to say that part of what I was doing with the friendship narrative is just sort of acknowledging constructs and almost tropes that are really interesting and that I love. And I think that female friendship is endlessly fascinating to me on different levels, again, as shown by the book. And it was important to me that Sasha sort of haunt the story, not just in the past, but in the present action of the book. I also think that something I'm sort of endlessly interested in is that we're always coming of age, but we sort of come of age with higher stakes, right? So Elizabeth is going through a crisis in the past, and Sasha is going through a crisis in the past, and the stakes feel relatively low in the beginning because they're teenagers and don't have dependents, and then things sort of get out of hand. Whereas the Elizabeth in the present tense going through something is just so much more higher stakes. The consequences are so much more real. Her inability to sort of wholly engage with her life, just it has a different effect on the people around her. And I wanted to sort of play with both of those. Also with the idea that, like, you know, this is a book in a lot of ways about caretaking and how often we, before we understand that we are doing it, perform our models, you know? So I think if Elizabeth were only performing her models as a 34-year-old, sort of more cognizant of their effects, the book would feel a lot safer. But watching her also perform her models at a much younger age, I think before she totally understands the damage she's capable of causing, was really important to me to keep her kind of culpable in the various violences of the book.
Yeah, I think one of many things the book feels wise about, and maybe simultaneously afraid of and unafraid of portraying is the relationship between being harmed and being in pain and causing harm, right? Like so often it's the particular blindness of the person in pain to not be fully cognizant of the ways in which they are also like inflicting pain and causing harm. And I love the ways that this book holds both of those, like the pain felt and the pain caused, in the same way it can look at a relationship and see pain in that relationship and also deep love, and sometimes just the pain that another person causes you just by being who they are and by being different from you and by moving through the world in a different way than you get to move through the world. And that's a kind of pain with a different sort of culpability behind it.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, so you said we want to talk about intimacy, and I desperately want to talk about intimacy. And there's so much complicated, I mean, this book is sort of, it's like a big fabric stitched of complicated intimacies. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about both the different kinds of intimacy that appear in this book in those categorical ways, like the kinds of intimacy between a mother and her kids, like the intimacy between a husband and wife, the intimacy between two friends in youth, the different intimacy between those friends when they are later in life and their lives have diverged a little bit. Like, what are the different kinds of intimacies that you were exploring in this book, and what was it that you were interested in or confused by or trying to kind of get at or ferret out about intimacy as you were writing these characters?
I mean, I think it starts with what you started with, right? Was this idea that like within a relationship, almost always we kind of flip back and forth. And I don't think it's as reductive as these terms, because I also think there's space for us to just love one another. But I think insofar as like these are high stakes moments in these people's lives, we sort of flip back and forth between the roles of victim and perpetrator, you know. And I think with Sasha especially, it was really, that was sort of how I structured those scenes, was to say, okay, Sasha's the sort of perpetrator of this section. Next section, Elizabeth is going to be the perpetrator, to sort of show those flips. And then with all of the other relationships, and I actually think the Chilean writer is maybe like on the opposite side of the spectrum with regard to like a certain kind of person, I think, who is afraid of their ability to enter relationships without accidentally hurting people, which I think Elizabeth is. And I think that's a little bit what you're talking about. There's something so thrilling about a relationship with someone like the Chilean writer, because her stakes in Elizabeth's life are so low, you know. And I think that's part of the thrill of that relationship. It's like a free therapist, right? Like she doesn't know much about her. Elizabeth doesn't really make much effort even to know much about her. She's just so grateful to have someone who will listen and care about her, and who won't accidentally be hurt by listening and caring about her. And then if you sort of pull back, right, in all of the other relationships, I think I was just constantly playing with that idea of, in what ways are these people sort of destined to hurt one another or not, based on the stakes that they've invested in this relationship.
And when you were talking about the kind of thrill, I think that's a really interesting way to think about the pleasure, the satisfaction, or the fulfillment, or the comfort of a certain kind of relationship, that it can actually be contingent on that person being sort of removed from your life in some way, rather than intimacy necessarily being compromised by somebody being removed from your life. And I was thinking about how weddings sometimes are so much more, they're easier to enjoy when you don't know the people who are getting married, when it's just like somebody your boyfriend was in a band with, like was like the best wedding, you know?
Yeah, no, and it's just this like vague sense of joy and party. Yeah, totally.
Like dancing with somebody.
Yeah, no, and that's, I mean, I think the book and I are both interested in this idea that there is an intimacy that comes that does not have to hurt. Like, I hope for that. I believe in that. But again, I think this book is exploring someone who's trying to sort of make sense of not coming from a love that isn't, of coming from a love that is in some ways damaging, or does in some ways hurt as much as it claims to be otherwise. But yeah, I also just think it's I'm really interested in relationships for which there is not language, right? Like, it's one of the reasons the husband is just the husband, because what a relief to have a husband, right? Like, you basically know you should be nice to him and have sex with him and great, but like, what do you do with a friend? Like, how do you prove to them you love them? What if they're your best friend? What if you do it wrong? Like, that's so much more interesting because the language is so much more slippery. Which is not to say that there's not a great marriage novel too. It's just to say that I'm sort of interested in those relationships where the roles are a lot blurrier.
Yeah, I once, I think there might even be a few people here who are part of this class. I once taught a seminar in large part about the literature of friendship, because I too am fascinated by a lot of those questions, like those relationships that we have fewer constructs or fewer scripts around. It's almost like the gardens are wilder, like the gardens of intimacy are wilder because they're stranger and we don't quite know how to describe what happens there. And different things grow in different parts of the garden, and a lot of different things grow in the garden of Sasha and Elizabeth in this in this novel across all the eras. And I think one of the things the novel is really smart about is how intimacy isn't just about those periods in your life when you're like engaging a lot with a person or spending a lot of time with them, but also you said early on that Sasha haunts some of the present tense of this novel, even during the periods when she and Elizabeth aren't in close touch. And I think one of the dimensions of intimacy that this novel is so smart about is like, that's still intimacy, like feeling haunted by somebody you haven't spoken to even in a while and stalking her on social media, like that's one of the forms intimacy takes too, is that kind of distance. And it feels like, to me, that tension between sort of feeling known and also feeling far away, whether you're sitting in the same room or on separate hosts, is part of what's at play here too.
Yeah. No, it's funny. A thing that I think is connected to that, and you're sort of talking about it, is the scenes when Elizabeth, and I can't help but admit that you and I just had this conversation too, but when Elizabeth sits and looks at her kids on Instagram, right? Which is to say that, like, there is the relationship with the thing itself, but also there is the relationship with the idea of the thing. And each of them has its own value, and each of them is its own type of intimacy. I think the danger that I was interested in, which I guess, like, I'm an asshole trying to make things hard, but like, I think the danger of that is we think because we're thinking of someone, it counts for them, and I think that's also something that I was interested in kind of exploring about intimacy, is if you're thinking of someone, even if they're taking up tons of space in your brain and in your body and all of these things, if you're not acting on that thinking, what good is it to them? And I think I was playing with that with Sasha, but also with other characters in the book, just sort of the way that our thinking and feeling feels like acting, but it very seldom is.
That makes me think also about the one of the plot lines in the coming of age when the stakes are higher plot line of Elizabeth as a 34-year-old in Brooklyn. So she's married, her relationship with her husband is part of that plot. They have children, parenting is part of that plot. They're filing for bankruptcy, financial precarity is part of that plot. But Elizabeth also works as a teacher. She teaches graduate students, and she teaches at a high school whose student population she describes as underserved. And part of what it means to work in that environment is very much thinking about, well, what's the value of good intentions, and when do good intentions start to feel like you've taken some kind of action, but what do those good intentions actually amount to? But I think they have so many different questions I want to ask, and people should start putting their questions in the chat too, because I'm sure they have them as well. But I'm curious what, you said earlier, this is a novel a lot about caretaking, which I find to be very true, the compelling part of the book. And one of those forms of caretaking, I think, is teaching in these two very different environments. And I wonder, what's your sense of the kind of role that Elizabeth's life as a teacher plays in this story? What parts of Elizabeth do we sort of see or understand in that aspect of her life, and how is it sort of working with the other parts of the novel?
I think it's maybe in some ways it comes back to that idea of ideas of things versus things themselves, but in a different version, which is to say that, like you say, in the high school, Elizabeth has more knowledge, certainly, I think, than a lot of her colleagues, especially her white colleagues, with regard to the level of value or import of her good intentions, but still her knowledge gets her nowhere, right? And it was important to me, right? Like, I think there's another version of this book where Elizabeth maybe thinks about those things or studies those things, but her ineffectuality isn't so explicitly on display. So it was, it was important to me that she be quite bad at her, I mean, not bad at her job, but she is bad at her job. Like, she crosses boundaries that are not really acceptable boundaries to cross, even as she claims to know things, and I think that was part of what I was trying to show, is that in that setting of the high school, her knowledge and her sort of ability to exist in the world of her intellect is just not as valuable as she thought that it was, and then she moves to the space of the university, and it is valuable insofar as she's probably better at that job. But then if you think about that relationship between abstraction and concreteness, it's all sort of a joke, right? Because it's valuable to her in the moment that she's teaching, but it's gig work. It has no value to her family, right? So I think I was constantly just trying to play with that idea of what is the value of this thing that she possesses, which I believe she possesses. It was intentional for me that she be intelligent and well read, and that be clear, and for the book to constantly hold that up against the real world and say, well, what of it?
There's a moment when it's describing that gig work, and I think it's I think it's actually really great. It has a real charge to even apply that phrase, which is, accurate enough, gig work, to adjunct teaching or that economy. Early on, the narrative says that part of why Elizabeth wanted to teach that grad student class, even if it wasn't bringing that much financial value back to her family, was that it felt good for a few hours to pretend to have gotten one of the things she wanted, i.e. a certain sort of officially recognized, like, capital S success. And I think one of the things that is powerful about this book, and I think I would be interested how you think about this question. One of the reasons that I think it's really kind of has had this like wildfire effect in the last few weeks and months. Like, people are like loving this book, talking about this book, and also really feeling spoken to by this book for a whole bunch of probably different reasons for every reader, which is part of what's great about books. But like, this book, among other things, is kind of like an anti-success story. And there's this moment when it's looking back at Elizabeth's childhood, and you've mentioned a couple times in this conversation, like, the ways in which the intimacy that Elizabeth grew up with as a child, like, didn't offer the kinds of love and support that one might expect from like family or home or parents. And Elizabeth's fraught relationship with her parents is a big and hard and painful part of this book. But there's this moment when she's describing dinner table conversations and says, sometimes I tell the stories that I know most please them, about doing well in track practice, or being asked to run with the boys, or getting good grades, these kind of success stories. But I think this book seems like it's really refusing that. It's like, I'm going to tell the story that I know won't please you. Like, this is the story of how my life went off track, or this is the story of how I didn't get the things that I thought I wanted. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of crafting a story about people who didn't make it in the ways they thought they were going to make it, and like how that, whether that feels accurate to you as a way of talking about what's going on in this book, and what dimensions of that not making it felt really compelling to you to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to say that, but I also think you're right to say the first thing that you said, which is in a lot of ways she has made it. It's just that making it is no longer an option or no longer a possibility, right? Because she checked all the boxes, like her husband checked fewer, I guess, in some ways than she did, but they sort of they did the things they were supposed to do to have a stable life. It's just that the avenues to having a stable life are more and more narrow as each year passes, right? So it would be a different book if Elizabeth dropped out of her PhD program, but she finished her PhD program, right? It would be a different book if, it would be a different book for a lot of reasons, but it was important to me that she checked the boxes. It just didn't matter, and I don't think, but also to your point about her going to the university, she also retains a level of agency, right? She continues to want a thing she knows doesn't exist. And that was important to me too, right? Like she checks the boxes, she knows it's not possible, but she can't help herself from still sort of wanting to perform the thing, even knowing that the thing is sort of a joke.
Well, and I guess it's funny, as we're talking, I find myself feeling like in certain ways a little bit defensive of Elizabeth too, like when you talked about how she's like sort of an ineffectual teacher in that high school environment, or like the grad school classes a joke. It's like I think it's deeply connected to this question of value and like what has value, or how do we even measure value, because it's like, you know, I mean, we've talked so much about boundary crossing. The number of times we talk about boundary crossing, like, I think that way that, yes, maybe she doesn't like play by all the rules of how her high school wants her to teach, but there's something deeply meaningful that happens in her engagements with some of her students. And that's not the only truth of what happens between her and the students, but there's care and respect and real teaching happening there. And similarly, there's real teaching happening in that grad school environment. There are things that feel meaningful even inside of structures that are broken or sort of flawed in pretty deep ways. And that feels like almost like a social version of what we were talking about earlier, that intimacy can hold like pain and love at once, right? That these structures can hold meaning and brokenness at the same time, you know. But I think it seems to me like you were writing Elizabeth's ability to have impact even alongside these ways in which she's sort of thwarted or frustrated.
I think, and I appreciate you defending Elizabeth, Leslie. I mean, I think you're right. I think she loves her students, and I think part of what the book is trying to look at, like you say, is what is the value of these individual interpersonal relationships under and within deeply broken systems, right? Because everyone is so desperate to survive that I think often people can't help but hurt one another, or often people can't help but not have the time or space to help one another in the ways that they wish that they could help one another, you know? And I think in that sense, it was important to me, whether it be the relationship with her student at the high school, that I think is, and I think in our many conversations over coffee, we would have probably agreed is a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. She feels deep love for everyone, and I think that everyone she teaches, and I also think she loves being a teacher. I just think she's also at that point, and there's the moment where she says it, where she's sort of like, okay, but I love my students, but I love my children more. Like I have to survive for them and figure out a way to take care of them. And this love of my students like doesn't feel like it's enough for me or for them, right? Because the systems are just more powerful than those individual relationships, which I say, and I still kind of want to take back, right? Like I still kind of want to say, but they are something, and I believe that they are something, and I hope that's where the book ends, is that like this matters. Interpersonal human relationships matter even under late capitalism. But I still think we need to fix the other stuff, you know.
I'm imagining the alternate title for this novel that was just like even under late capitalism.
Right.
Like the boundaries of the possible. I mean, I think to your point, like, you know, even just what you were just enacting when you were speaking of sort of like wanting to assert the potency of individual relationships, but also maybe the structures are more powerful, but also don't the relationships still matter? It feels like, isn't this part of what novels are for, that like op-eds can't do, right? Is to kind of hold all of those truths and let them all be real and felt and tangible on the page, and not actually have to have one single unqualified thesis that just like
no, I think, I mean, and again, we've talked about this, but other people weren't there. But you know, this idea of the novel as a space to be fully embodied, right? Like I was talking to my brother-in-law this morning, who's a philosopher, about this idea of when you say I have a body, it's already too far from the experience of being a human, and instead to say like I am embodied, right? So sorry, that's like, but you know, the sort of binary of the mind and the body, like I don't actually believe in. And so I think fiction gives readers the opportunity to get inside of minds and bodies at the same time and see all the ways that they're experiencing this sort of push and pull. Like I wanted, and I shouldn't say this in case some of these people haven't bought the book, please buy the book, but I wanted it to feel like, I wanted it to make you a little bit nauseous, just in terms of that, like she's not just being pulled and pushed intellectually, she's being pulled and pushed physically, and again, I think that's what fiction can do. I've said this a bunch of times at this point and it feels sort of frustrating, but I'm saying it because I believe it. Like, I don't want to make an argument. I'm not sure I believe in arguments. I think the minute I make an argument, the people on my side nod knowingly, even if they don't understand. And the people who aren't on my side sort of shake their heads and move on. I want to force you to get inside of the bodies of these people and try not to look at them, And yeah, I think fiction can do that. I think your nonfiction does it too. But um, I don't think I'm as good of a nonfiction writer as I am a fiction writer.
I'm sure my nonfiction has nauseated some
And that's a goal. It's a good goal.
I love that. I love both your opening point about even the difference, because it's not just a semantic difference, right? Your philosopher brother-in-law, I'm sure, knows better and more deeply than either of us the difference between saying I have a body and I am embodied, but how that might translate to a kind of craft orientation around fiction, like how to ask a reader to be inside a character's body rather than looking at it or regarding it or analyzing it. And I was really curious to ask you about kind of embodied experience in these pages. We heard it in the sections that you read aloud, the kind of intimacy of sharing the cheeseburger, or for some reason, I always remember that moment where Elizabeth takes the last bite and it's too big and she puts her hand to cover her mouth, and the intimacy was that phrase, the buzz of her hands on my neck was the closest thing to joy I'd felt in months, when Elizabeth is describing Sasha shaving her head. There's a relationship, Elizabeth has a relationship with her neighbor, Jocelyn, where often she notes how many times she and Jocelyn have touched each other in their interactions. There's a lot of physical touch in these pages, and it's a craft choice too, right? Like you as author are noting and letting us know about those moments of almost like these little electric flashes. And so I wonder what you think about the role of those, and probably the different roles of those different kinds of sort of physical touch. When is physical touch sort of intimate? When is it not intimate? Maybe when we would expect or hope it to be intimate. Like how do bodies come together, and how is that helping us understand what these characters are doing with each other?
I think it is not always intimate, but to me at least, it is always kind of extraordinary and charged, right? Which is to say that there's also like some alienating sex in this book, right? Like, I think touch, it's connected to this body thing, right? That like touch is a way of communicating with other people. First of all, not absent of language, but different from language, right? Which again is important to me for this character who lives so much of her life inside of language, inside of abstraction. But also like this whole book, my sort of continued thing to myself was, where is her body? What is her body doing? And that was partially touch. It was also just temperature. Like she's cold a lot, she's hot a lot, like she sort of can't get the temperature, right? Which is just to say that I think these experiences of her body were, I hope, an attempt to mimic some of the experiences of her brain, but also to show all the ways her brain was getting things wrong, right? And also to show the ways that we create narratives around touch in the same way that we create narratives around, ideas. Like I think Jocelyn's a great example. Like Jocelyn touches her, that feels deeply intimate to her. She almost like checks in her brain, okay, this must mean something. But through the period of the book, we find out she didn't really know Jocelyn at all. Like their intimacy was actually quite limited and basically neighborly, but Elizabeth had created such a strong narrative around those physical interactions, So again, I think it's all mixed up, like this touching and not touching. It's funny we're talking about this now when we don't touch that many people. And something I've been thinking about a lot, which is different, but I think similar, is smell, like how intimate it feels right now to smell new people's smells. Like when you when some kind of jerk comes too close to me when he's running, and I'm like, ooh, like, you know, I've never smelled that smell before. We're not there yet, you know, like it's a little bit of a boundary crossing now, you know. Which again, I think she's really capable of intimacy in her head. I think intimacy in her body, she's less good at. And so I think it's more present to her and more jarring to her when she feels it.
There's a moment when it's describing her family of origin where in relation to Sasha's, that they hug less, and that she sort of never knows what to do with her body around the question of like hugging and being hugged. Yes, on all senses on smell. I realized, you know, when I was sick in March, I realized how much I missed smelling even horrific things, how that actually felt like a loss, which I think, you know, to your point about the ways in which, like, even when touch isn't fully intimate, it still has a kind of electric charge. I think there's a way in which, like, characters are seeking, you know, the title of the book is Want, right? What do characters desire in these pages? They're seeking like ways of feeling alive that aren't necessarily always about pleasure. There's this a great scene at a kid's birthday party when they're sort of talking about different like spas that feel good across the city, and then this one mom is like, well, I just want to be fucked by a stranger. And there's this way that's like, that's not touch as like feel good close connectivity, it's touch as like having an experience. And like Elizabeth goes running every morning, and it's often like kind of brutal, it's often cold, she often gets hurt, like but it feels like there's there's a charge even in that which isn't comfortable or pleasant, and that's not beside the point, it's kind of like part of the point.
Yeah, there's this amazing, I shouldn't bring this up this late in the conversation, but there's this amazing NPR thing that I listened to years ago that I think about all the time, where this guy, he understood the weight of a concept, but he didn't understand the quality. Like it was like something that happens to your brain. So at the marriage of his best friend, at the wedding of his best friend, he accidentally gave a speech about the very violent death of his mother, because it was the most intense, it felt of a similar weight, right? But he didn't know how to differentiate the value. And I find that endlessly interesting, because maybe we don't all have that thing, but I think we often have humans have some version of that, where it's like, okay, weight counts for something, you know? So like maybe I can't experience extraordinary joy, but maybe it would be interesting to experience extraordinary pain, because at least it's experience, like you say, you know? And so I think Elizabeth is doing that, especially with intimacy. It's just sort of like, and that woman too, right? It's like, I'm not sure how to get the quality right, but why not just get the impact? Because at least that's something.
I also, it's fascinating, that story you described, and I totally want to overhear all the conversations that ensued, like after that toast was given about violent death. I have a million more questions. I'm going to ask just one more, because I see that there are a lot of great questions from everybody else who's here. So I'll ask this question, and then John can jump back in to let you know all the smart things that people have been wondering about in their assembled Zoom squares. I guess this really is a question that has to do with weight and what we decide has weight and what doesn't. And one of the things that I think is so striking and unconventional about this novel, and I think part of the reason that people are responding to it, maybe even if it's not always what is being explicitly articulated, is that you narrate a lot of things that people might call just kind of like pragmatics or banal, like the kind of some of the logistics of filing for bankruptcy, or even like physical moments like taking too big a bite of cheeseburger and putting your hand over your mouth, or kind of pulling out the cell phone to turn off the alarm, or, you know, these things, like there's a kind of minute attention to the pragmatics that make up the day-to-day, which are often the things that like narrative thinks, oh, I'm going to whittle these things away to tell a story about what matters. But it feels like part of what this novel is saying is like, no, that shit matters. Like that is where life is lived. But I wonder how you thought about that from a craft dimension, because you're such a gorgeous writer and you're also such a gorgeous teacher of writing, how you sort of thought about pulling that off craft-wise, like how to narrate pragmatics without, how to choose which ones and how to let them sing without flooding us with them, you know?
I mean, I think I'm almost certain I've told you this, and I told a lot of students this, but I have this sort of obsession that one day I'll be a good enough writer to write an entire novel where the only thing that happens, it's that two women stand in a kitchen barefoot and don't talk, right? That like, I think all of the life lives there. It's exactly what you said, right? Like all of the life lives there, all of the joy, all of the pain. Like when people die, we're not sad because they can't fight a war or win a Pulitzer. We're sad because they don't get to wake up in the morning and smell their kid's hair, you know, or at least that's why I'm sad, right? Because that is where the life lives. And I think, I mean, craft wise, I hope, although I'm sure some people disagree, the way that I tried to make it not boring was I tried to just keep it moving, you know, and I tried to, it was again, this sort of minute attention. Like I find daily life fascinating and often almost like nauseatingly right, like that same sort of like it's thrilling and it's joyous, and then someone's lying on the floor yelling at me because of the seam of their sock, and then you know, and like again, like I think it's all there, and I think if you look hard enough it's so much more compelling because it's also so much more recognizable to other humans, right? Like not everybody has fought battles, or I mean I feel very sort of Wolf is just here sort of saying clearly, shut up, I taught this years ago, you know, but you know, like most people don't find their joy in major cataclysms or ruptures, right? And I want to talk about life. I think novels are different than life, but I want my novels to be interested in life, and I want my novels to engage with the joy and pleasure and pain that lives in the daily, because that's also the like the only thing that I feel certain about, right? Like I don't believe in other sides, and I don't even really believe in cataclysms, right? I believe in sort of this daily accrual of experience. So yeah, I mean that's why I built the book this way, and I hope, I mean it was the physicality was my attempt to make it interesting, right? Like I think if she's just sitting and thinking and we're not in her body, we don't feel how intense it can be to just be in a body making coffee.
I love everything you said. So funny. Like what a world we've arrived at when like feelings of like surging aesthetic kinship can best be articulated by like a small clapping emoji in the corner of our Zoom square. And yet this is the language available to me.
Here we are.
I see John's beautiful face and pickle shirt back to ask you some questions from the audience.
I have a couple good questions from the chat, but first I want to ask my own question, which is that your narrator says that in grad school she studied forgotten or actively discarded female writers. And the list is Penelope Fitzgerald, Anita Bruckner, Jean Rhys, Nella Larson, and Lucia Berlin. I think since the theme of tonight's conversation was intimacy, I'm especially interested in the inclusion of Anita Bruckner, only because when we opened this bookstore at the beginning of March, the shelves were a little thin, which was a problem. And so to fill out British Lit, I just ordered every Anita Bruckner novel. I've only read 3. Look at Me, Undue Influence, and Friends and Family. But I had enough faith and have enough faith that they're all really great. But in the context of tonight's conversation, I think it's curious because it seems like she wrote maybe the same book like 30 or 40 times, an amazing book 30 or 40 times. And that book is about a single woman who falls into the orbit or gets drawn into the orbit of usually a couple of intimates, and then questions whether she's lived the wrong life. And there's intimacy in those, at least the 3 books I've read, but it sort of happens off page. And that's sort of the case with all those actively forgotten female writers. And I wondered why those writers and whether there were any that didn't make the cut. And yes, I think that's my question. And then I'll get...
Well, I mean, first of all, I will just sort of say, which now will force people to not buy anything else I write, but like, I do kind of think we're all just writing the same thing over and over. I mean, I think it takes different shapes, but like, we're all sort of writing. My friend on the phone the other night was like, do you think maybe this book, the one I'm working on now, should be about something besides family? And I was just like, do you still want to be my friend? Like, I don't understand what you're talking about. So on that note, I feel like that's interesting, and Hotel de Lac is the one I would do next. But yeah, I mean, I think part of what I was doing with the books is first to show the way that she is living this other life, and she does have these sort of intimates to some extent that she depends on. But also, I think this idea that as sort of women writers have gotten more attention, a lot of the time it feels a little bit like, oh wow, she's doing this thing, she's talking about being a woman and no one's ever done this before. And it's sort of like, well, no, people have been doing this for a very long time, you just weren't reading it, right? Like the New York Times just wasn't reviewing it, right? Like Penelope Fitzgerald like won awards, but like no one let her sit at the tables at the awards banquets because she was a dowdy 63-year-old woman who wrote brilliant fiction. You know, it's just, I mean, they all of those women are there because, first of all, I don't think fiction is written in a vacuum, and I feel like the idea that any novel is sort of doing something new, not only is that not true, but it's less interesting to me than all of the ways a novel is engaging with everything that came before, you know? So it felt, I mean, there were too many that didn't make the cut, and I got sort of sick as you said that, because I was like, lots and lots. But also, I like really like, to some extent, I mean, all of the characters' names too are from novels. Elizabeth is Mrs. Dalloway's daughter. David is from J.M. Coetzee. Like, you can sort of play the game and find them. Or I'll tell you, Sasha is Jean Reese. But I just wanted to give my ladies their due. You know, like I love them. I love them, and I wanted as many of them to be with me as possible.
Well, it's a good list. It's a
Thank you.
List.
Thank you.
I have a question from Rachel.
Rachel
says, I'm so sorry to ask this obvious question, but so much of what the book explores, the impossibility of parenting while being everything else you want to be for yourself and others, financial precarity, not being able as a teacher to be everything your students need, feels a million times more so in these times. Do you feel prescient or freaked or think you would have done anything differently if you'd known you were publishing into a pandemic?
Rachel. I mean, I think the idea of prescience has been tricky for me, if only because the idea that everything has been broken for a long time has felt so present to me for a long time, that now the fact that the last thread has finally sort of fallen away, it feels almost inevitable. So the fact that I'm publishing a book in the face of that thread disappearing, you know, I don't necessarily know what to do with that fact. I think it's, on a personal level, it's sad to not get to hug my friends. It's sad to not to get to go to parties. On a more collective level, it's deeply devastating to see what's happening to people's lives. I don't know. I have a hard time relating it to my work, just because it's sort of like, I made a book engaging with ideas that are true, that I think are true. Back to this idea of not believing in cataclysms. I don't think we're in this situation because of COVID. I think we're in this situation because of our broken systems. Like, New Zealand is fine. Plenty of countries are okay. Like, this shitty thing that's happening to us is not a virus. It's this country. And insofar as that was what my book is about, I was sad about that before, and I'm really sad about that now. I was tired before, and I'm tired now. I'm much more scared and worried now, which is generally pretty terrible. But I think it does help me day to day sort of not be as concerned with what's happening with my book, because I really just want everybody to be, I want people to be okay. I want us to get to some sort of other side.
Mariah says, I really love your idea that thinking and feeling may feel like acting, but ultimately they do not equate to action. In the context of a main character who is well-read and intellectual, I'm curious, reading, learning, pursuing higher forms of education, do these behaviors function as forms of action for the character, or are they forms of merely solipsistic thinking and feeling for her?
Mariah is our babysitter, and she's amazing. I think it's I think and my kids are not going to be so sad that Mariah's here and they're not. I think it's both. You know, like I think it's that moment that I read with the Chilean writer, which is to say that like, and I'm just going to speak for myself here. Like I regularly think that I will go do something more active, and then I realize how deeply ineffectual I am in a lot of other aspects of my life, and how I feel like I've gotten pretty okay at language, and so it's, to some extent, it's just like this is what I have, this is what I can do. Um, but I think it has its limits, you know, and I think in a lot of ways that's one of the book's driving tensions is just like this matters. In fact, I think it matters too for Elizabeth to be in a classroom with Black and brown kids and say, my job here is to teach you to be better communicators. And what's more important in life than hearing from people that we don't listen to, right? Like that's valuable, that matters. Whether or not teaching people to communicate means they'll be listened to is another thing, right? So and it's back to Leslie's question too about this idea of these interpersonal relationships versus these larger systemic issues. Is I do think it's valuable. I do think reading is valuable, writing is valuable, these pursuits are valuable, but I think they have limits.
I think we have time for one last double question, half from Kat and half from me. Kat says, how long ago was the book conceived of and written? How long did it take you to write? And my question is, what do you think the relationship is between Hold Still and Want as a fan?
John. So the first question first, I wrote another book for a long time, and it didn't work. It didn't sell, and it was very sad, and all of these things. And then I sat down and wrote the first draft of Want over a very short period of time, over about 8 or 9 weeks. And then I sort of spent a few months rewriting it. And you know, but it was generally very short, and it was the shortest I've ever taken to write anything. And I have since found, and I know this is true, I'm not just like disassociating, like there were sentences in the book that I had emailed to myself as much as 2 years prior, you know. So it's just I sort of believe, especially like as a mom, in this idea of the dam breaking, you know, like these were ideas I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. I had a lot of jobs and I have 2 very young kids, and I was thinking about them and taking notes about them and sort of moving images around in my brain. And then there was this period of time in which I had fewer jobs and my kids were otherwise occupied, and I knew that that was what I had, and I got up at 3 every morning and I just went. And so there is a version of this story where I wrote it over a short period of time. I always hate those stories, and they always enable students in ways that I don't love. So I do think it took much longer than that. John, to your question, when my husband read, he didn't read it till recently, and when he started to read it, he was like, "Did you just write the same book?" Which is right, like it's an academic. She lives in Brooklyn. She's a mom. There's overlaps. I'm trying to stretch myself with the next one. She runs. Thank you, Rachel. She runs. I think with Hold Still, I was trying to write. I'd never written a book, you know, and so I thought, okay, this is what books are. One of the things that I thought, which I'm deeply embarrassed by, but because it's just you and me, John, and because you love Hold Still, I'm going to tell you, I thought books had to be about attractive, wealthy white people, because so much of the canon is about attractive, wealthy white people. And so I wrote this book about attractive, wealthy white people. And then I engaged with all of the concerns I'm engaged with, which I think is the limits of the ways that we love each other, the limits of our ability to communicate with one another, the way that we perform our models. And I think with Want, I felt a lot more confident as a writer, and I felt as engaged in the concept of like, if Hold Still was me writing a book as I understood books, I think this is the book I wrote when I said, what is the book that only I could write, sort of structurally, thematically, just in its movement, in its language? Like, how can I reconsider the form of the novel? Like, I think I felt up for that task with this book. I wasn't anywhere near that task with Hold Still.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for being our moderator tonight. Thank you, Lynn, for the gift of your book. The link to buy it from us is in the chat. You can also find the link to buy Leslie's latest book, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. You can also find the link to see which Anita Brookner books we have here at City Point, and you can order them for pickup and come see me anytime between 12 and 7 days a week.
John, put the Penelope Fitzgerald on too. Can you do
Penelope
that?
Fitzgerald. What's your favorite Penelope Fitzgerald?
The bookshop.
What do you like? The Blue Flower?
I do, but we can't talk about it. But it's great. It's great. It's great too.
It's totally fair that McNally Jackson would promote the bookshop, and it's there in the chat now. All right. Well, thank you to the two of you again for this wonderful event. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Go to McNallyJackson.com.
Can I say thank you to Lynn for writing the book that only Lynn could write?
Leslie. Oh man, I got like a little highfalutin at the end. I don't know.
No, I think it's absolutely true. And I think it's like you feel it, like an electric current running through the book.
Thank you guys. Thank you everybody for coming. I can't see you, but
for coming.
We're on gallery.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to unmute themselves and wish her.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Let's go on gallery. I see Rachel now. Where's Peony?
That I hope.
Okay. Nobody has a baby, but it's still good to see everybody. There's Mariah. Oh, this is fun.
Thank you, Lynn. It's good to see you.
Thank you guys. Who do I see?
Hey.
Oh, hi.
Hey,
This is cool. See, this is